What's up, guys? Mr. Irvin here, and today we're going to be talking period 7, which is a monster of a unit. There's so much kind of embedded in this thing. It's stretched from 1890 to 1945, and the dates that are going to kind of frame this unit are the rise of the antitrust movement in the 1890s. You got the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is going to lead us into progressivism at the very beginning of the time period. And then by the end, it's going to be capped off by the end of World War II. Now, there's going to be a ton of terms that you're going to see in these slides. There's no way we're going to have a chance to go through all of them. And so I'm going to encourage you to just kind of listen to the stories that we're going to talk about today and go and kind of do your own additional research to make sure you really got this period of time down. So our first story is imperialism. And you'll notice that in period 7, America is getting way more involved in world affairs. And so imperialism is really the beginning of that. And the United States seeks to kind of build an empire overseas, similar to what a lot of other European countries are doing at this time period. Now, there's a number of reasons why the United States would want to do that. One of the reasons is that the Second Industrial Revolution had been happening prior to this time period, and the United States wanted access to more markets overseas. In addition to that, there was also growth in nationalism, and we even see Americans wanting to spread our culture and our religion overseas. So there's, in some ways, imperialism is an extension of manifest destiny that came before. There are lots of different reasons, but we see America kind of putting its toe in the water towards imperialism, first with you can make an argument, the purchase of Alaska, but we really kind of see it with the Spanish-American War, which takes place in 1898. Now, President William McKinley is in charge, and we get involved in the Spanish-American War for a number of reasons. One is that we see Spain mistreating the Cuban people, who we sympathize with and are a southern neighbor of ours. In addition to that, there's also yellow journalism that is taking place during this time period that is kind of exaggerating some of the treatment of the Cuban people and really kind of turning American public opinion against Spain. And then, of course, there's also just desires for land. Now, we go to war in the Spanish-American War. Our Secretary of State actually calls it a splendid little war. And even though it lasts only a few months, it has significant consequences for the United States moving forward. Most notably, America is going to gain new lands. So we're going to gain Puerto Rico. We are going to gain Guam. We don't take control of Cuba, but we do exert influence over Cuba. And finally, we annex the Philippines, which becomes by far the most controversial element of the end of the Spanish-American War. Now, this sets us on a course for imperialism that's going to continue for not only the McKinley's presidency, but some of the presidencies that come after. Now, McKinley's not done. There's other things that he's going to do. Most notably, probably the open door policy, which allows America to kind of end the spheres of influence within China and get to start trading with China to a greater extent. But then following McKinley, after he's assassinated, you've got Teddy Roosevelt that's taking over. And Teddy Roosevelt's policy of imperialism is going to be called the big stick diplomacy. It's based off of an African proverb that says, speak softly and carry a big stick and you shall go far. The idea being that, Teddy Roosevelt was willing to negotiate with other countries, but when push came to shove, he wasn't afraid to use the military in order to empower the United States. And we see this probably most obviously with the Panama Canal, in which we actually help kind of support a revolution so that we can gain access to Panama and the building of a canal there for American trade. Following the big stick diplomacy of Teddy Roosevelt, you've got dollar diplomacy, which is the policy of Taft, and that is where we're still going to get involved in foreign countries, but we're doing it primarily for the economic benefit of the United States. And then lastly, there's the moral diplomacy of Woodrow Wilson, and this is the idea of the United States is going to get involved in other countries to promote our democratic values. So Wilson was probably the least imperial of these presidents, but he still represented kind of an extension of these imperialist policies. that begin under McKinley. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone was imperialistic during this time period. There are obviously those that opposed it. There's an anti-imperialist league that is led by a number of Americans. William Jennings Bryan becomes an important voice against imperialism as well, and especially against the annexation of the Philippines. And so this is going to kind of get America established as a world power during this time period. Now, at the same time America's imperializing, we see kind of our second story taking place. And this is the increased role of the federal government. This is such an important story for period 7, because what's happening throughout this time period is we see the government getting more and more involved in the lives of its citizens. So before this time period, in period 6, we had kind of this laissez-faire approach by the government, in which the government kind of kept a hands-off approach, especially when it came to the economy. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people calling for change. The Industrial Revolution created a number of different problems, and there were a lot of people that wanted to use government to fix those problems. And those people become kind of what together part of a movement known as the Progressive Movement, and kind of usher in something called the Progressive Era. So the Progressive Era was led by middle-class Americans, many of them women, who wanted to, they were firm believers in government. They believed in our democratic system, and they wanted to use government to fix all the different problems that they saw emerging out of the Second Industrial Revolution. And a few, probably notable progressives included Robert La Follette with his Wisconsin idea, and he brings in kind of a lot of progressive reforms to fix not only to tackle big business, but also make our government more democratic in Wisconsin. What makes the Progressive Era a national movement, though, was the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. And when McKinley is assassinated and Roosevelt becomes the president, he institutes something called his Square Deal. And embedded in the Square Deal is a bunch of progressive reforms, and probably the best way to think of it is his 3 C's. His 3 C's included, control over corporations, consumer protection. We see that in, for example, the Meat Inspection Act and the creation of the FDA, but then also conservation and his protections of the environment. Okay, so the Progressive Era is doing a lot to try to reform society. It's also expanding the rights of women. The 19th Amendment comes out of the progressive movement as well, but it's not addressing all the problems in society. Most notably, African Americans are really left out of some of the reforms that are being pushed by progressives. And so we see civil rights leaders emerging to kind of deal with these problems on their own. Most notably during this time period are the ideas of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who are both fighting for greater civil rights, but in different ways. Now, the Progressive Era is killed by World War I. Obviously, takes our focus away from these reforms that are going on. And in the aftermath of World War I, you've got the Roaring '20s, which is an era of transition in the United States. And from a governmental perspective, we see the government maybe taking less of a kind of a more hands-off approach, especially when it comes to business. It's a more conservative era. But we kind of see this divide between people that are pushing for change and people that want to keep things exactly how they were. So we see the struggle probably best with immigration. And there are people who are nativists who feel threatened by the number of immigrants that are coming into the United States, especially what we call new immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern European countries. And they're pushing for what eventually becomes the Immigration Code Acts, versus obviously people that embrace immigration as a source of a cultural diversity and new ideas. So we see that push and pull in immigration, but other things as well. We see this in religion. We see growing concerns over new technology and what that means for America. We've got this push of values that's kind of taking the place of it's taking place in the form of prohibition. But in general, in terms of the 1920s, it is a period of transition. And it's also important because the consumerism of the 1920s is going to lead us into the stock market crash by the end of the decade and the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression is the worst economic downturn in American history. It has a lot of different causes. Some of those different causes include Americans buying things on credit in the 1920s with money they don't have, a large distribution of wealth gap between the poorest Americans and the wealthiest Americans. We see people that are speculating in the stock market, and we also see weaknesses in the banks that are going to cause bank failures. All those things lead to the Great Depression, and the Great Depression has a catastrophic effect on the American economy. And the president who's in charge when the stock market crashes, which is Herbert Hoover, is initially not going to take much action. Believing that if the government gets too involved, that could destroy rugged individualism. But his inaction leads the public opinion to kind of turn against him. And by 1932, you've got FDR, who's going to be elected on the promise that he can do something about this economic downturn. And what he ends up doing is a series of programs in which the government is getting more involved and taking an active role in trying to fix the economy, and not only fix the economy, but also kind of give people jobs and provide them relief during the Great Depression. And this series of programs is called his New Deal. And it massively changes the role of government. It makes the government much larger. We see this in the form of new programs. They sometimes called the alphabet soup of government, like the FDIC, which stood for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that was designed to protect like people's savings accounts and banks. You've got the WPA, which was designed to create like construction jobs. You got the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps, that provided young men work doing conservation. But you also had other programs like the Social Security Act. And to be honest, there's too many to name right here. But these programs are going to expand the size of the government significantly and also give the government new responsibilities that it didn't have before. Now, it's important to understand that the New Deal, restores people's faith in the government. It gives people hope, but it doesn't end the Great Depression. What's going to actually end the Great Depression is the start of World War II, which is going to create a huge economic uptick as the United States starts to mobilize for that war by 1941. So the government is constantly expanding, and we're going to see that going into period 8 as well. The last story is kind of the rise of America as an interventionist country. And when we say interventionist, what we mean is the United States is becoming more and more active in world events. Now, it wasn't all. So the United States gets involved in World War I in 1917. And there's a number of reasons why we get involved in World War I. Woodrow Wilson himself was concerned about unrestricted submarine warfare, in which mainly Germany was not only targeting British ships that Americans were traveling on, but in some cases, American ships were sunk as well. So we saw this as a violation of our neutrality on the high seas. We had an economic connection to the Allies, but probably most significantly in the mind of Woodrow Wilson was this idea that we could influence the peace process and maybe make the world safe for democracy, as he put it. We're only involved in that war for a little over a year, and Woodrow Wilson, at the conclusion of that war, actually goes over to Europe to help negotiate the peace agreement. He takes with him what he calls his 14 points. And those 14 points are going to be kind of his way of creating a lasting peace in the aftermath of this terrible, terrible war. Well, the problem was that the treaty that comes out of those negotiations, the Treaty of Versailles, doesn't reflect a lot of those 14 points. Now, Woodrow Wilson himself, he supports the treaty because it contains a League of Nations and brings it back for the Senate to ratify. But in general, after the war is over, America's moving towards more of an isolationist mood. And Senate Republicans actually reject the Treaty of Versailles. We never adopt the treaty. We never join the League of Nations. And in the aftermath of World War I, America, in the same way, is kind of rejecting their role as a world power, as an interventionist country. And so we go into this era of American neutrality and American isolationism that's really going to last from about 1919 all the way up to the start of World War II. And in that time period, the United States is going to kind of pull out of European affairs. We view World War I as a mistake. It doesn't mean we're not going to be involved at all in world affairs. We do a number of things, like the Washington Naval Conference takes place in the 1920s. The United States is going to have a good neighbor policy towards like Central America in the interim. But for the most part, America is staying out of like world events. Now, as time goes on, America finds it more and more difficult to remain neutral, despite the fact that we do everything in our power to continue to maintain neutrality. We even passed neutrality acts in the 1930s, which prevent us from getting involved in like foreign conflicts. But the rise of dictators overseas is going to end up dragging America into the coming World War. So we see, like, for example, tensions growing in Asia as Japan invades first Manchuria in 1931 and then invades China, our ally, by 1937, violating the open door policy. Over in Europe, we've got the rise of Mussolini and Hitler. We see them starting to carve up parts of Europe. Hitler himself, unifying with Austria and then taking over Czechoslovakia, and then the start of World War II with the invasion of Poland. So all of these things are very, very alarming to Americans. And what happens is we start to gradually be snapped out of our neutrality, our neutral mindset. And we start to realize that America has to use its economic power, its military power, in order to help our allies. So the best example of this is with the creation of the Lend-Lease Act, which happens in 1940 in order to try to aid Great Britain as they are holding out against Nazi Germany. The Lend-Lease Act, as well as other aid that we provide, are really, really important, but that's not how the United States gets involved in World War II. America doesn't actually fully become involved in World War II until the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And that attack fully snaps America out of any kind of isolationist sentiment that it might have had prior to that time period. Now, World War II is one of the most transformative events in American history because not only does it completely change our domestic policies, for example, it officially ends the Great Depression. It creates a huge boost in the American economy as all of our factories become kind of outfitted for the war effort. It also changes America's foreign policy here. And so the United States, becomes completely embedded in World War II. We're going to fight on two separate fronts, both over in the Pacific front and over in Europe. And as that war winds down by 1945, it's going to kind of completely reshape American foreign policy. So unlike World War I and the aftermath of World War I, where America rejected its role as a world power, in the aftermath of World War II, America is going to embrace its role as a world power. And now the United States is going to use that power to try to influence the world, spread its ideas of democracy, and that's going to lead us into a lot of things in period 8, specifically the Cold War. So that's all we got for this story. Make sure you take a look at some of these terms in greater depth and make sure that you continue to study for your test. Take care, guys.